Okay, let's dive into the mind of René Descartes. Today we're really getting into his discourse on the method.
Yeah, it's his own story, right? How he decided to basically wipe the slate clean and build up knowledge from scratch.
Exactly. We've got the text right here, and our goal is to, understand the process he laid out, the foundations he found, and how it all shaped, well, so much of how we think even now.
That's right. This isn't just some dry historical text. It's really a personal intellectual journey. Descartes walks us through why he was so unhappy with the learning of his day,
Mm-hmm.
then the steps he took, these really revolutionary steps, to find certainty,
Mm-hmm.
and the core ideas he landed on and how he started applying them to, understand the world.
It's this project of radical self-reliance and chasing truth. We're going to look at his critiques of education back then. The development of his famous method, his big philosophical arguments, the one,
Yeah, the one.
and even some of his early scientific thinking about the physical world, right down to the human body as a machine.
The main thing is to really get the process, and the foundation he thought was absolutely necessary to genuinely know things. This deep dive is about getting to the core of how he thought we could get to certain truth, using his own words to guide us.
Exactly. So as we explore this, I want you, our listener, to think about his whole approach. What clicks with you? What seems totally impossible now? What feels surprisingly modern, or maybe just completely alien? Let's kick things off at the beginning.
Part 1. The starting point, doubts, and disillusionment.
So Descartes starts with this interesting premise. He says everyone thinks they have enough good sense or reason.
Right. He kind of suggests reason itself is equally distributed. The big difference isn't how much you have, but how you use it, how you actually apply your mind.
It feels humble, but maybe it's strategic too. He's not claiming he's smarter, just that he decided to use his own reason more carefully, to find the right path for his own thoughts.
Absolutely. And he talks about his education. Top-tier school, one of the best in Europe. Learned all the subjects, read all the extra books.
By any standard back then, he was highly educated.
And yet he finishes feeling completely lost. He says he found himself caught up in so many doubts and errors. He felt like he gained nothing really, except discovering just how ignorant he was.
Yeah.
He basically concluded there wasn't any certain and indubitable science like he'd hoped for.
That feeling, finishing school and realizing how much you don't know, it's actually kind of relatable, isn't it?
Totally. He goes through the subjects: languages, fables, history, eloquence, poetry. He saw their value, sure, for stowing the mind or helping judgment.
Mathematics, too. He liked its rigor and usefulness. Morals gave good advice.
Theology.
Yeah.
Well, it showed the way to heaven, but he felt its truths were above human comprehension. You needed divine help, not just human reason.
But then philosophy, that was the sticking point. Studied by brilliant people for centuries.
Right.
And yet, nothing was settled. Everything was still debated, still doubtful. This pushed him to a really radical position. He decided anything only probable was pretty much false.
Wow. That's an incredibly high standard for truth.
It really is. And since other sciences, like medicine or law, built on philosophy.
He saw them as being built on shaky foundations.
Yeah.
He wasn't interested in the honor or money from those fields if the base was so weak.
So he dished the books, the formal studies. He decided to look for knowledge in the great book of the world. Travel, observe different cultures, different customs.
And the key thing he got from traveling, seeing how stuff we find totally extravagant and ridiculous is perfectly normal somewhere else.
Right.
It taught him not to believe things just because of custom or example. It helped him escape errors that could, darken natural intelligence.
But even out in the world, he found contradictions everywhere, conflicting opinions, even on practical things. This ultimately forced him, as he puts it, to use my own reason to guide himself.
Yeah, he decided to study himself, basically, to find the right path, knowing he had to proceed carefully, like someone walking alone and in the dark.
Which leads us right into part 2. Building anew, the foundation of method. This is where the real blueprint starts taking shape.
He sets the scene. He's holed up somewhere in Germany for the winter, no distractions, just him and his thoughts. Perfect setup for some philosophical demolition work.
Yeah. And a core idea here is his analogy about single masters.
Right. Buildings, cities, laws. If they're designed by one person from the start, they tend to be more orderly, more perfect than things cobbled together over time by lots of different people, or just by chance.
And he applies that directly to knowledge. Science is built on lots of different opinions are probably less true than the simple, clear deductions of one person using their natural reason without prejudice.
Especially since our childhood judgments, formed under all these conflicting influences from parents, teachers, desires. They're likely pretty flawed from the get-go.
So the big proposal: tear down everything he'd previously accepted on trust. Rebuild his knowledge entirely on a foundation that was wholly my own.
It's audacious. He uses the analogy of someone rebuilding their own house. You can do that privately. But reforming a whole state or city, that's way harder, riskier. Sometimes the old customs, even with flaws, work better than sudden upheaval.
But he's careful here. He adds this warning: this radical doubt and rebuild project isn't for everyone.
Definitely not. Not for impatient people or those who rush to judgment, or even for people who, quite rightly, trust others' judgment more than their own. He keeps saying this is his story, his path.
Okay, so then he looks back at the methods he already knew. Logic, syllogisms, useful for explaining things, maybe, but not for discovering new stuff.
Right, and geometry, algebra, good, but too abstract, too caught up in rules and symbols sometimes, he felt. Limited.
So he wanted a new method, something that combined the strengths of logic, geometry, algebra, but without their weaknesses. Like a well-run state with just a few essential laws, but laws that are strictly followed.
Exactly. And instead of tons of rules, he boils it down to just four. Four key rules for his method.
Rule number 1, certainty. Accept nothing is true unless you clearly and distinctly know it to be true. No room for doubt. Avoid rushing and prejudice.
Number 2, divide and conquer. Break down every problem into as many smaller, manageable parts as needed to solve it.
3, order. Start with the simplest things, the easiest to know, and build up step by step to the more complex. Even impose an order on things that don't seem naturally connected.
And finally, number 4, be thorough. Make your lists and reviews so complete that you're absolutely sure you haven't missed anything.
These 4 rules, they're basically a blueprint for critical thinking that we still use today, right? Breaking down problems, checking assumptions.
Absolutely. He was inspired by geometry's long chains of reasoning. He thought all knowable things were linked like that. Follow the method, start simple, and nothing's unreachable.
He didn't try to learn all of math, but focused on the core ideas of proportion and relation, using symbols to make it manageable. He felt this blend of geometry and algebra was really powerful.
And he claims it worked incredibly well for him in mathematics. In just a few months, he could solve tough problems, figure out what was solvable and what wasn't. He put it down to starting simple and using each truth as a rule for finding the next.
He really believed this method trained the mind for clearer thinking in any subject. But he knew he wasn't ready to apply it everywhere yet. He needed to root out his old mistaken beliefs first, gather experience, and just keep practicing the method.
Which brings us neatly to part 3, living while learning the provisional morality.
Right. If you're tearing down your whole intellectual house, you need somewhere to stay in the meantime. A temporary moral code so you're not just stuck, unable to act while you're figuring everything out.
Makes sense. So he sets up this provisional code, maybe 3 or 4 main rules or maxims. First one, obey the local laws and customs, stick to his religion, and follow the most sensible, moderate opinions of the judicious people around him.
And crucially, judge them by their actions, not just what they say, because people don't always know what they really believe.
Exactly. And choose moderate views. They're practical, probably closer to the truth, and less risky if you turn out to be wrong. He also avoided making binding promises that might limit his freedom later, since he expected his judgment to improve.
Okay, second maxim. Be firm and resolute in your actions. Once you've chosen a path, stick to it, even if the reasons weren't perfectly certain.
Like being lost in a forest, right? You pick a direction and keep going straight. Hesitating or changing direction constantly just gets you more lost. In life, you often have to act. So act on the most probable option and treat it as certain for practical purposes. He found this stopped him from feeling regret later.
Third, try to conquer yourself rather than fortune or external circumstances. Change your own desires rather than trying to change the world order.
This is a big one. Recognize that only your thoughts are truly, absolutely in your own power. If you do your absolute best regarding external things and they don't work out, well, that failure was external. It wasn't really your failure.
He thought this was the key to contentment, like the ancient philosophers found. Stop wanting what you can't have. But he admits this takes serious practice and meditation. It's not easy.
And his fourth point was really about his life's purpose, reviewing occupations and choosing the best one. For him, that was clear. Devote his life to cultivating reason and seeking truth using his method. This gave him such intense satisfaction, he says.
He connects these maxims back to his main project, They support his self-instruction by forcing him to use his own judgment, not just accept things. Controlling desires comes from knowing he's on a path to real knowledge and genuine good. Right action follows right judgment.
So he puts this into practice, spends 9 years traveling, observing as a spectator, using this time to spot and get rid of errors based on custom, applying his method constantly to check if things were false or uncertain.
He's clear, though, he's not a skeptic just doubting for doubt's sake. He's looking for solid ground, rock or clay, as he puts it, certainty.
Right. And he found that by rigorously applying his reason, even to doubtful things, he could reach reliable conclusions, even if that conclusion was just that something was totally uncertain.
He used all these observations, this experience of dismantling old ideas to build newer, more certain ones. And all the while, practicing his method on math and science problems, feeling he was making way more progress than just reading books or talking to people.
He mentions why he waited so long to publish his philosophy, though, partly because people started saying he'd already figured everything out, which put pressure on him to actually live up to that. So he found a quiet, secluded place to focus.
Which finally leads him to part 4, the first principle, I think, therefore I am, the bedrock.
Yeah, this is where he goes full-on metaphysical, searching for absolute certainty through that process of systematic doubt. He knows it might sound a bit strange, but it's necessary to show his foundations are solid.
He stresses again the difference between practical certainty for everyday life, where probabilities are fine, and the quest for absolute truth, which means chucking out anything with the slightest possibility of doubt.
So he starts doubting everything systematically. Senses, they trick us sometimes. Maybe reality isn't what it seems. Reasoning. People make mistakes, even in simple math. So maybe all my past reasoning was wrong.
Right.
Waking life versus dreams. Sometimes they feel identical, so maybe this is all just a dream right now.
Yes.
But in the very act of doubting all that, he realizes something is undeniable.
Yes. He notices that even if he assumes everything else is false, it was absolutely necessary that I, who thus thought, should be somewhat.
Exactly. The thought itself proves the thinker exists.
I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. It was so certain, so clear, that no skeptical argument could touch it. This, he decides, has to be the first principle of his philosophy.
So what is this I that thinks? He reasoned he could imagine having no body, no physical world around him, but he couldn't imagine not existing while he was actively thinking. If he stopped thinking, poof, no reason to believe he existed anymore.
So the I is fundamentally a thinking thing, a substance whose whole essence is just to think. It doesn't depend on a body or any physical place. It's distinct from the body, and, he argues, actually easier to know than the body.
That's the famous Cartesian mind-body dualism right there.
Okay, so he has his first truth. I think, therefore I am. What made it so certain? He reflects and decides it's because it's so clear and distinct in his mind.
Which leads him to a general rule for truth. All the things which we very clearly and distinctly conceive are true, though he immediately adds a caveat figuring out which ideas are truly clear and distinct. Well, that's the tricky part.
Right. Then he thinks about his own nature. The fact that he doubts proves he's imperfect, right? Because knowing is clearly more perfect than doubting. Yet he has this idea within him of something more perfect than himself. Where did that idea come from?
Couldn't come from nothing. Couldn't come from himself, because he's imperfect. The less perfect can't create the idea of the more perfect.
So he concludes, the idea of a perfect being must have been put in him by a being that is truly perfect, a being with all the perfections he can conceive of. That's God.
He adds another layer, too. If he could create himself, he would have given himself all those perfections he lacks. Since he didn't, he must depend on this more perfect being for his existence.
He also reasons that God, being perfect, can't have imperfections like doubt or changeableness. And God can't be composite, like a body and soul together, because composition implies dependence, which is an imperfection.
Okay, so how does proving God exist help with knowing things for sure? Descartes connects it back to geometry. Geometric proofs are clear and distinct, sure, but they don't prove that, say, a triangle actually exists in the world, just that if it exists, it must have certain properties.
But with God, he argues, existence is part of the very idea of a perfect being. Just like having angles summed to 180 degrees is part of the idea of a triangle. So God's existence is as certain as a geometric proof.
Why don't more people see this? He thinks it's because they rely too much on imagination and senses, which only deal with physical stuff. The idea of God, or the soul, is purely intellectual. Trying to imagine God is like trying to hear with your eyes, he says.
So the punchline, without knowing, God exists, and that God is perfect and therefore truthful, not a deceiver.
Right.
We couldn't be absolutely sure that even our clearest and most distinct ideas are actually true. They might still be illusions. But because a perfect God exists and wouldn't deceive us,
Our clear and distinct ideas, which must ultimately come from God, must be true. Any confusion or obscurity in our ideas, that comes from our own imperfect nature, our participation in nothingness, as he puts it.
this finally lets him tackle the dream argument again. Because God guarantees our clear and distinct perceptions, we can distinguish waking reality from dreams. Even if you had a clear insight in a dream, like a math proof, the insight itself would still be true.
The usual errors in dreams, like senses fooling us, are just like sensory illusions when we're awake, seeing the sun is small, for example. They don't undermine the truths grasped clearly by reason.
So, the takeaway from this whole metaphysical part: trust reason and clear, distinct ideas above all else, whether you're awake or asleep. That's where reality is found, guaranteed by a non-deceiving God. Imagination and senses, useful, but not the ultimate source of truth.
It's heavy stuff, but that's the foundation he built, which then lets him move, in part 5, from metaphysics to the physical world, kind of hypothetical universe and the human body as a machine.
Right. He says he found a whole chain of truths based on these first principles, but he's not going to lay them all out here to avoid arguments.
Yeah, he wants to stick to his method, only accept what's clear and certain. But he claims he did use these principles to figure out the main problems in philosophy and discover the basic laws of nature, which he believes God put into our minds. He felt he'd found really useful, important truths.
But instead of publishing his whole physics theory, which he worried would cause controversy, he decided to summarize it by describing a hypothetical new world. Imagine God creating matter from chaos and just letting it follow these natural laws he'd established.
It was a clever way to talk about his ideas, how light works, how the heavens and earth could form, planets, stars, gravity, tides, mountains, metals, plants, all emerging naturally from these laws, deduced from God's perfection, without directly challenging the established views of his time.
He even gets into fire, heat, colors, states of matter, the transformation of ashes into glass. He wanted to show these laws could explain everything.
And he clarifies, look, I'm not saying this is how our world was made, but the way God sustains the world now follows the same laws. So thinking about how it could develop from chaos according to these laws makes nature easier to understand than just assuming it was instantly made perfect.
Then, and this is crucial, he applies the same mechanical thinking to living things, animals, humans.
Right. He tries to explain things like growth, movement, sensation, purely based on the arrangement of physical parts, plus this internal heat or fire without light in the heart, kind of like fermentation. He argued you didn't need to invoke special vegetative or sensitive souls for these functions, which was the common view.
He gives that super detailed example of the heart and blood flow. He asks you to picture the heart's chambers, valves, vessels, and explains it like a pump. Blood comes in, gets heated and expands rapidly, forces valves open and shut, making the heart and arteries pulse. Then it cools, contracts, lets more blood in. It's all mechanical necessity based on the parts, the heat, the nature of blood, like a clockwork mechanism.
And he explicitly mentions a physician of England, that's William Harvey, who had recently discovered blood circulation.
Right. Harvey showed blood goes in a circuit, from arteries through tiny passages to veins and back to the heart. Descartes fully incorporates this.
He uses Harvey's evidence, too, tying off veins and arteries, the one-way valves and veins, to support his mechanical explanation of how this circulation works, driven by the heart pump and blood heat.
He then tries to explain everything based on this circulation. Heat distribution, breathing's role in cooling or modifying blood, digestion, nutrition. It's all particles being moved around and filtered by the mechanics of the body.
And he brings in animal spirits. He pictures these as the finest, fastest parts of the blood, like a subtle fluid or flame, going from the heart to the brain.
Like a control system.
Kind of, yeah. From the brain, these spirits travel down the nerves to the muscles, causing them to contract or relax, producing movement. It's his mechanistic explanation for nerve signals and muscle action.
So the whole body, even the human body, is described as an incredibly complex machine. Nerves, muscles, all moved by these animal spirits. He even uses the example of involuntary movements in severed heads. A bit grim.
A bit grim, yeah. But it's to show that some movement is purely mechanical. He compares the body to these amazing automata that God could make, far beyond human invention.
But, and this is a huge, but for him, how do you tell a human apart from a sophisticated machine or an animal? He gives two key tests.
First, language. real language use. Machines might make sounds, parrots might mimic words, but they can't arrange words flexibly to express thoughts or hold a meaningful conversation, responding relevantly to anything said. He points out that even humans born deaf and mute invent sign systems to express thoughts. It's not just about vocal cords, it's about reason. Animals lack this.
Second test. The lack of a universal instrument. What he means is reason.
Exactly. Machines, and animals too, might be brilliant at one specific thing because their organs or instincts are designed for it, but they fail miserably at other things. Human reason, though, is universal. It can be applied to any situation in life.
He argues it's basically impossible for a machine to have enough different mechanisms to act appropriately in all the diverse situations life throws at us, the way reason allows humans to.
And he finds it really significant that even the least intelligent human can string words together to convey thoughts, while the smartest animal can't. It's not about having the right organs, he says. It proves animals have no reason at all. Their clever behaviors are just instinct, like a clock running its program.
And why is this distinction so important to him? Because if you think animal souls are like human souls, you might end up thinking there's nothing after death for humans either.
Right. He felt that was a dangerous error, second only to denying God. Understanding the huge gap between human reason and animal mechanism shows the human soul is different, independent of the body, and therefore potentially immortal.
Okay, deep breath. That brings us to the final part, part 6. The path forward, why publish now, and what's next for science.
He explains the 3-year gap after finishing his big physics treatise. He heard about, well, Galileo's condemnation, essentially. Someone else whose physics touched on similar areas got into trouble. And even though Descartes felt he'd been careful, he got worried his own ideas might be misunderstood or seen as attacking religion or the state. Plus, he admits he just wasn't that keen on writing books anyway.
Fair enough. So what changed his mind? Initially, he didn't feel the need to publish when his method was just for his own thinking or personal morals. Most people think they're wise enough already, kind of jokes.
But as his physics developed, he saw it wasn't just theory. It offered knowledge highly useful in life. A practical philosophy, if we understand nature's forces.
We could use them. Become lords and possessors of nature, he says.
Yeah, especially for improving health, medicine. He saw health as the most fundamental good. And he started to feel it would be a serious sin to keep this potentially beneficial knowledge to himself.
But he realized his method, while powerful, needed more than one lifetime. And crucially, it needed tons of experiments. Way more than one person could do or afford.
So the plan became, share what he'd found so far, communicate it publicly. The hope was to inspire other smart people, men of superior genius, to push further, help with the necessary experiments, share their findings, collaborate.
Combine efforts across generations, basically, to speed up progress.
He really emphasizes experiments here. As knowledge gets deeper, he says, experiments become more essential. Early on, basic observation might be enough. But later, when your principles could explain something in several different ways, you need specific experiments to figure out which explanation is the right one. And that takes a lot of work, a lot of resources.
So why didn't he publish his main principles earlier then, if collaboration was needed? Well, he thought maybe few people would really get it. He wasn't looking for fame.
And he felt he learned best by figuring things out himself. Publishing would just lead to arguments and distractions from his real work. Critics, he felt, usually just wanted to win debates, not find truth. School disputes, he calls them.
He also felt his work wasn't quite finished enough to be immediately useful to others, and maybe he was still the best person to carry it forward for a while. Plus, he valued the process of discovery for others too, not just being handed answers.
The help he really wanted. Money for experiments and time free from interruptions. But he wasn't actively seeking favors.
So what finally did push him to publish at least these specimens, the essays on optics, meteorology, geometry, along with the Discourse itself? 2 main reasons came later.
First, reputation management. Rumors were maybe starting about why he wasn't publishing his big work. He wanted to put something out there to counter any negative speculation.
Okay.
Second, the sheer scale of the experiments needed became undeniable. He realized his own progress was stalling without help. The infinity of experiments I require, he says. He felt a duty to future generations to at least show them the path he'd started.
He picked these specific science topics, like optics and meteors, because they showed off his method's power, but maybe wouldn't cause huge fights or force him to reveal all his core philosophical principles just yet.
And he makes an open invitation. If you have objections, send them to my publisher. Let's get them out in the open. I'll respond, and readers can judge for themselves. He promises to be frank, admit mistakes if he's wrong, but defend his points clearly.
He also addresses the term hypotheses he uses in those science essays. He says, look, these are actually deduced from my first principles, even if I didn't show all the steps here.
Right. The causes, his principles, explain the effects, observed phenomena. And the fact that the effects are observed confirms the reality of the causes. He called them hypotheses, partly so people wouldn't just grab his principles and build some extravagant philosophy without really understanding the foundations.
He wraps up by reaffirming his commitment. His ideas come from reason, they're simple, they align with common sense, he believes. His plan: spend his life studying nature to improve medicine, avoid useless controversies, what he values most: quiet retirement to think, not fame or fortune.
Wow, it really is an incredible intellectual journey laid out there, following him from that point of just radical doubt about everything.
Yeah, tearing it all down.
To finding that one anchor point, I think, and using that to argue for a perfect God who guarantees our clear thoughts. Then building a whole method, a provisional way to live, and applying it to map out the physical world, even seeing the body as this intricate machine.
It really shows his deep belief in the power of individual reason, doesn't it? And the absolute need for certainty as a starting point. Plus that vision of knowledge, not just for knowing's sake, but for actually doing things, for becoming lords and possessors of nature.
But then there's that tension at the end.
Yeah?
This incredibly personal, solitary quest.
Right.
Colliding with the realization that truly advancing science, especially practical science, like medicine, needs teamwork. It needs collaboration, resources, experiments far beyond what one person can manage.
It definitely leaves you thinking. If you consider his whole project, rebuild everything from scratch, based only on what's absolutely certain, well, how much of what we think we know is built on stuff we've just accepted? Customs, assumptions we've never really questioned.
Exactly. What would it even look like to apply Descartes' method, that systematic doubt, to one of your own strongly held beliefs today? To really try and find the solid ground, the rock or clay underneath it.
That feels like a challenge that resonates way beyond the 17th century, a really provocative thought to end on.